Welcome to the Fragility Forum 2022 podcast series produced by the Fragility, Conflict and Violence Group of the World Bank Group. As complexity and uncertainty become the new normal, with complex crises posing new challenges, from the COVID-19 pandemic to climate change, this podcast series explores how the international community can best support countries affected by fragility, conflict and violence in a fast-changing global landscape.
Welcome to the podcast, Economic Inclusion in Fragile Contexts. Can it improve the well-being of the most vulnerable? My name is Janet Heisey, and I'm a senior consultant with the Partnership for Economic Inclusion at the World Bank. Joining me today are Aidan Colville, senior economist in the World Bank Development Impact Evaluation Unit, Rachel Boqueta, Country Director of Women for Women International in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Teresa Beltramo, Senior Economist and Head of Research and Analytics at the UN's High Commissioner for Refugees, and Nathaniel Goldberg, Director of Sector Programs at Innovations for Poverty Action. Each of our panelists will share findings from research on graduation programs in 5 countries: Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Nigeria, Mozambique, and Uganda, and consider whether and how graduation models work in contexts of fragility, conflict, and violence, or FCV contexts, as it's known in the World Bank. First, let's talk about what is the graduation approach. Now, this is the methodology used by the programs we'll discuss today, and it was developed by BRAC in Bangladesh in the early 2000s. It's a multidimensional approach that acknowledges the multiple hurdles people living in extreme poverty face as they seek to increase their income and assets and create sustainable livelihoods. So to help participants overcome these hurdles, graduation programs often utilize at least 5 components, often including consumption support, cash transfer, business and life skills training, financial services such as savings groups, and mentoring. The graduation approach was pioneered by NGOs like BRAC, and it's been taken to scale now by governments and other actors, becoming an integral part of a sector now known as economic inclusion. These programs have been able to scale because of the evidence generated by research, and particularly impact evaluations, that they're particularly effective and cost-effective because they're suitable to build on existing government social safety net programs. And given that the World Bank projects that 2 out of the 3 of the world's poor will be living in FCV countries by 2030, there is a question as to whether these programs can be effective and whether they should be scaled in FCV contexts. So with today's panel, we hope to understand whether these models work in FCV contexts, how they're being adapted to perform, and what kind of challenges they're seeing in their research. So first up, I'd like to open the floor to Aidan Colville from the Development Impact Evaluation, or DIME department at the World Bank, who worked on an evaluation of a government-implemented graduation program in Afghanistan. Aidan, this program in Afghanistan was one of the very first graduation programs led by governments, and it was quite a complex context within which to launch a program. Can you tell us a little bit about how this program took shape and what were some of the early challenges in getting it off the ground?
Hi, Janet. Our story starts way back in 2013. We were actually asked to measure the impact of the Targeting the Ultra Poor, or TUP program, which was a $15 million project being delivered in the country. And so at the time, there was actually really little evidence about the potential impact of these interventions, but there was skepticism that such a complex, multifaceted program could actually be implemented in a fragile context like Afghanistan. So in addition, the price tag of nearly $2,000 per household generated a lot of debate. So why spend so much money on so few rather than spreading the resources out to support more people? So the debates reflected a real challenge. There is so little evidence on what works in FCV settings, and it is often unclear how to effectively direct the significant financial support on offer. As the World Bank and other donor partners scale up their support to FCV countries, directing these resources efficiently becomes a first-order concern. So the collaboration faced a lot of significant hurdles to overcome right in the beginning. The first challenge was whether something as complex as the TUP program could be implemented in a setting like Afghanistan at all. In this regard, we were lucky to have been able to work with an incredible implementing partner. The Microfinance Investment Support Facility for Afghanistan, or MISFA for short, led the program, and together with the World Bank operations team, we developed a rigorous set of monitoring tools to carefully track what was being implemented where, and collaborated on a series of workshops that we used to then bring tools and evidence from various other settings to help give the project the best chance of a success at the outset. The second challenge that we had was pressure to redirect the funds to other initiatives, given the high per capita costs of the intervention. In many ways, this was understandable, right? Without evidence to substantiate the program, this level of investment required an incredible leap of faith. In early 2016, the government considered closing the TUP program before implementation had even begun. But fortunately, just at this time, evidence of the transformational impact of the program was actually just beginning to surface from other countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Ghana. So we worked together to package the existing evidence and make the case to continue supporting the TUP program despite initial concerns. And based on a more concrete understanding of the potential the program offered, the World Bank and the government eventually agreed to proceed with the TUP, but it was a very close call.
That's amazing how that developed. The trade-offs for investment that you describe are really at the heart of challenges that so many governments face and funders. And it's even more difficult, of course, in FCV contexts. So happily, having gained permission to launch the program, can you tell us what were the challenges you faced and what did you learn from that evaluation?
Sure. So, once the program was off the ground, the next challenge was how to generate high quality evidence in a setting where World Bank staff were actually restricted from even traveling outside of Kabul. We worked together with MISFA to develop a set of high quality assurance tools and launched one of the first tablet-based surveys in the country in 2016. These tools are now being packaged to improve data quality in other fragile settings within the team, and we're hoping to make this a public good for others working in FCV settings. But somehow through all of these various challenges that we faced, MISFA was still able to deliver the program, reaching nearly 100% of the target recipients, and we were able to be there to document what it was at least possible to achieve in an FCV settings to improve the lives of the world's poorest and most vulnerable. You can't imagine how excited we were when we finally had the chance to actually start looking at the data and understand the impacts of this program after so much time. On pretty much every dimension we looked at, we found significant improvements, from consumption to psychological well-being, labor force participation to financial inclusion. Possibly most exciting to see was how the program improved women's empowerment across a range of different dimensions and started to close gender gaps in education, workforce participation, and other dimensions of well-being that we had observed at the start of the program. And what about the cost? Well, a very conservative estimate, only focusing on the improvements in consumption, suggested that for every $1 spent on the program participants experienced $2.3 worth of consumption returns. So while the risk and complexity of working in FCV settings means that we should always account for the real possibility of program failure into our planning, the success of the TUP program, in this case, offers insight into what is at least possible and provides a bit of a roadmap for how to tackle poverty for some of the most marginalized people in the world. We're now exploring the longer term impacts of the program, and we'll hopefully have something more to share in the near future.
Thanks so much for this, Aidan. The results from this research have really expanded our understanding of what's feasible in FCV countries and contexts. And I really want to underscore the fact that you're developing some resources to improve data quality in other fragile settings, which I think is a real value add for the community at large. Now I want to turn our attention to graduation programming in another protracted conflict setting, specifically targeting ultra-poor women. Rachel Boketa is the country director of Women for Women International in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Rachel, could you please tell us about your program in the DRC and what you've learned about the program's impact?
Oh, thank you, Janet, for having me here for this conversation and providing me the opportunity to speak about our program's impact and the context we work in. As you know, Women for Women International has been investing in ultra-poor women in conflict settings since 1993. And in the DRC, we conduct a 12-month gender graduation approach called the Stronger Women, Stronger Nations program since 2004. This program is designed to enhance women's social and economic empowerment and participation, mindful of their unique experiences and needs. And through complementary program, we engage with men community leaders, policymakers, and program graduates to address discriminatory social norms and practices and create an enabling environment for women's social, civic, and financial participation and agency. We work in Eastern DRC, so we need to be flexible and creative implementers. And we conduct constant security surveillance and risk assessment. We design programs to take into account our participants' exposure to conflict, violence, and trauma. For example, fostering social connections and support amongst participants is central to our programming. We are proud of our graduation rate of around 95%, despite the challenging context we work in. And you know, it's a common knowledge that almost 70% of the population in the DRC lives below $2 per day. That has been said in so many literature available. But in South Kivu, women are 7 times more likely than men to be survivalist entrepreneurs, which means they live below the poverty line and they often lack control of their own assets, personal income and resources, and they rarely receive inheritances. So both conflict-driven and domestic violence against women and girls is normalized. We conducted a recent randomized evaluation with Dr. Rachel Heath and Dr. Manuela Angelucci, and that research showed that the Stronger Woman, Stronger Nation, which happens to be our signature program, had large positive effects on consumption, employment, finances, women's empowerment, and health, and those effects remain 2 years after the program started. Net earnings increased by 20%, and household saving amount tripled. Women's participation in household decision-making increased, and so did women's feeling of being in control of their lives. The program has a benefit cost ratio of 3.68 and an internal rate of return of nearly 20%, the exact figure being 19.9.
That is fantastic, Rachel. You've seen impact in so many areas here, but I'm really struck by the improvements in household decision-making that you described, which may partly stem from that engagement with men and others in the household to create an enabling environment. It's also really interesting to hear about Women for Women's efforts to develop social cohesion, which I think is an area of particular interest. Can you further describe how variations in programming might have contributed to household resilience during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, sure. And for this question, I'm going to turn to Nigeria, where we recently completed an evaluation with Tufts University to measure impact of add-on to our gender graduation program. The full analysis is forthcoming, but I can share with you here some preliminary findings. 3 years and a half after the program starts, we saw significant improvements in women's earnings and saving behaviors, access to credit and repayment of loans, and diversification in income generating activity due to 6 months of post-graduation mentorship and VSLA add-on intervention. VSLA standing for Village Save and Loans Association. Additional analysis we did with the American Institute for Research showed that membership in VSLA reduced the likelihood of economic losses during the COVID-19 pandemic. And in addition, women with higher self-efficacy scores were more likely to maintain profitable activities during the lockdown. Those results provide compelling evidence for the strength of that gender graduation approach in fragile settings. And they show how smaller budget additions to an existing bundled approach can boost participant outcomes, enhance sustainability, and contribute to household resilience during shock.
Thank you, Rachel. It's just great to hear the results that Women for Women International has been able to achieve in the DRC and Nigeria, and particularly those results during COVID-19. Given the breadth of the experience with economic inclusion programs globally, understanding better what these barriers are that people face in fragile and conflict-affected settings and how programs can be designed to overcome them is absolutely paramount. Next, let's turn to Teresa Beltramo, Senior Economist from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Teresa, I know that UNHCR is very interested in understanding the vulnerabilities associated with forced displacement and how economic inclusion can help people overcome them. Can you tell us a little bit about how UNHCR is working in the economic inclusion space and how you designed this particular research project in Mozambique?
Thanks, Janet. Ever since the graduation program, has been proven to be an effective tool at improving welfare outcomes for the world's ultra poor, here at UNHCR, we have pursued implementing the graduation approach in forced displaced settings. We began piloting the graduation program in a handful of countries back in 2013, and then more recently, HCR and partners have expanded our investment in the graduation program for refugees and hosts through the Poverty Alleviation Coalition, which aims to raise some $700 million US for expanding to 35 countries by 2025. Given the size of the investment and the specific vulnerabilities refugees and other forcibly displaced peoples face, we believe it's important to understand more fully how, if at all, vulnerabilities associated with forced displacement require adaptation of the standard graduation approach or their established outcomes. To date, no evidence has been published measuring the impact of the graduation program on refugees. And to fill that gap, myself and Dr. Sandra Seguera at LSE measure the impact of a UNHCR implemented graduation program which targets poor refugees and host households in and around the Marathon refugee camp in rural Nampula, Mozambique. The Marathon refugee camp is home to about 9,500 refugees and asylum seekers, primarily from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Burundi, Rwanda, and Somalia. The camp is surrounded by some 16,000 host community members who depend on the camp for social services provided by UNHCR and the government. The graduation program in Mozambique is funded by the government of the US and started with an initial cohort of participants in 2018. For this impact evaluation, we follow the second cohort who were identified using a poverty scorecard approach modeled after the one used by the government of Mozambique to enroll nationals into social safety net programs. This impact evaluation includes 160 households, about half refugees and half hosts, enrolled in the graduation program, and some 300 plus control households. Cohort 2's program ran from 2019 to 2021 and includes consumption support as well as cash transfers related to the selected employment track, a suite of skills training, including on resume writing, soft skills, language and financial literacy, market-oriented skills, and vocational training, as well as coaching services to provide encouragement, build self-esteem, and to personalize interventions to individual needs. The program also includes facilitation with self and wage employment, including a paid apprenticeship to improve linkages to jobs so that participants with limited experience can increase their employability. To understand better specific vulnerabilities in the community, among other measures, we look at mental health. And at baseline, prior to the intervention, we find that 3 out of 10 refugees and 2 out of 10 host individuals report experiencing depression, with more women than men exhibiting signs of severe depression. And this is in line with global health estimates, which suggest that 1 in 5 persons living in conflict-affected areas, double that for populations not affected by conflict, suffers from some form of mental disorder ranging from mild depression or anxiety to psychosis, while 1 in 10 is living with moderate or severe mental disorder.
There are quite a few interesting elements in this program, and I'm particularly struck by the self-employment and wage employment opportunities, which we're hearing about. I'm just wondering, what are some of the other key areas of inquiry that your research focuses on?
Yeah, indeed. The impact evaluation aims not only to understand the standard impacts of the graduation program on labor, income, and food security, but also to measure the impact of the program on social cohesion, trust, and mental health for both the refugee and host community. To date, we've undertaken 3 survey waves and are planning to undertake a final survey in April 2022, some 2.5 years after the program began. Our results to date are promising, showing beneficiaries of the graduation program have positive and lasting impacts on food security and income when compared to controlled households over the same period. We also find that evidence of this graduation program designed specifically in this context to increase exposure of refugees and hosts to working together has a positive impact on social cohesion, trust, and social norms across the 2 communities. These last findings are especially important in refugee settings where improving social cohesion between refugee and host communities can prove essential to providing long-term solutions underpinned by economic and social integration. This work has not been without its challenges. For all the randomized controlled trials I've designed and implemented, this has certainly been by far the most challenging. Forced displacement settings can bring additional risks to program and evaluation implementation due to the shorter time planning horizons of humanitarian versus development actors and the instability inherent in some of the refugee hosting areas. In the case of the graduation program in Mozambique, we faced initial challenges with the refugee community accepting to participate in this program due to the false belief among refugees that participating would negatively impact their chances of being resettled. Our team in Mozambique worked months with the community to assuage concerns about resettlement and in turn build confidence around the benefits of participating in the graduation approach.
Teresa, thanks so much. I'm really glad you mentioned the challenge of refugees worrying that participation in the program might affect their resettlement options. We can see parallels to cash transfer recipients who sometimes fear that they're going to lose benefits if they join onto the program. And it's so good to share experiences in these sensitive areas. I think there's a lot of learning across FCV contexts and elsewhere. And now let's turn to our last speaker, Nathaniel Goldberg from Innovations for Poverty Action, who will tell us about another study which is also taking place in a refugee context in Uganda. Nate, can you tell us what's specific to the graduation program implemented in Uganda and what are you learning about its impact?
Hi, Janet. IPA and JPAL researchers had published a study in Science in 2015 showing strong impacts from graduation programs in 6 countries. And USAID's Office of Food for Peace, which is now integrated into the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, wanted to know if such a program could be effective at improving food security and self-reliance among extremely poor households and refugee settlements, as well as host communities. We were interested in this as well, and also had questions about the most cost-effective way to scale graduation programs. So my colleagues and I at IPA worked with the NGO AFC and USAID to design an evaluation that would determine whether the graduation approach works in a refugee population. And at the same time, try different versions of the program at different cost levels. A full program, a group-based version, and a version without an asset transfer, which is typically one of the most expensive components of the program. The Graduating to Resilience program was implemented in Uganda by AFC with Trickle Up and Impact International in Kambwenge district, which hosts the Ramwanja refugee settlement. This settlement is home to approximately 57,000 Congolese refugees, most of whom arrived in or after 2012. AFC conducted a poverty assessment among 35,000 households and identified 25,000 as eligible to benefit from the program. Defined as households which were extremely poor or poor with a woman or youth who are or can become economically active. The refugees were much more likely to be eligible, 92% eligible compared to 60% in host communities. Despite that difference, it's important to remember that the non-refugee population is quite food insecure. Up to 2/3 of the population in the region experience some level of food insecurity. The eligible households were randomly assigned to one of 3 treatment arms, or control groups in treatment or control villages. Each arm had 2,200 households for a total of 11,000 households in the study. We conducted a baseline survey in 2018 before the program began, and we completed the endline last year in 2021. A quick background on randomized evaluations for those who may be unfamiliar. The key element here is the study participants are alike on average at the start of the program. So if we see any differences later on, we can be confident that the differences between the groups were caused by the program. To make that work, we need a sufficient number of households in the study so we can rule out any differences being simply due to chance. The program ran for 30 months from 2019 to 2021. The households received most of the standard components of a graduation program, starting with the consumption support in the form of weekly cash transfer of $4 to $5 per household member for 12 months. This is to get them to a basic standard of living and make sure they don't sell or consume the productive asset which is meant to generate income. For that, most of the participants also received a cash transfer worth about $300 to invest in productive activities. This didn't apply to those selected for the no asset version of the program. Participants received training and participated in group savings, and they received either individual or group-based coaching in groups of 25.
Thank you, Nate. This is so interesting to hear the nuts and bolts, both of program design and evaluation design. Can you give us a hint? What were your findings?
When we look at the end line data, we see very strong impacts overall. 1 year after the end of the program activities or 2 years after the initial asset transfers, participants have greater monthly consumption and income, value of productive assets, and subjective well-being. We see large improvements in food security. The number of households considered severely insecure doesn't fall all the way to zero. Impacts are similar for host and refugee participants. So this answers the first question, whether the graduation approach can work in a refugee setting. On our other question of how best to scale the program, we see quite a clear pattern among the treatment arms. The individual and group-based versions of the program perform very similarly. That suggests that the lower cost group version is probably the way to go, but it's only slightly cheaper. The households in the version without the asset transfer don't do quite as well as the other treatments, which suggests that may not be a good place to cut costs. And I'll end by noting that we're continuing to work with AFC and USAID to conduct a second round study in which we'll be measuring the long-term impact of the program and also new program components, including low-cost group-based therapy for participants.
This is really exciting research. Thanks so much. Aidan, Rachel, Teresa, and Nathaniel, I'd like to thank each of you so much for sharing your experiences today. We've heard many examples of how programs in fragile and conflict-affected contexts, as well as in situations of forced displacement, have seen some positive results, similar to earlier graduation in other settings. Whether it's increased household consumption and reduced poverty, as we heard in Afghanistan and the DRC, especially as it relates to COVID-19 pandemic in Nigeria, and improve food security, as we just heard about in Uganda, the trends are really encouraging. And of course, the recent impact evaluation study by Women for Women showed similar positive outcomes to graduation programs in non-conflict settings. But of particular interest, given these challenging contexts, are the encouraging results related to challenges that are particularly critical in FCV settings. Improved social cohesion in the DRC and social cohesion and trust in Mozambique, improved women empowerment outcomes in the DRC, large improvements in food security in Uganda, and important impacts on gender inequality across multiple outcomes in Afghanistan. The challenges to both programs and evaluations in FCV contexts are made clear, but despite these, the 5 studies we've heard from reveal positive impact of graduation programs across a range of outcomes. 2 of the studies that conducted a cost analysis find good internal rates of return and benefit cost ratios, suggesting that investments in these programs really does pay off.
This wraps up this episode of the podcast series. Thank you for listening, and please check out our other podcast. For that, and to learn more about the World Bank Group efforts in environments affected by fragility, conflict, and violence, please visit our website www.worldbank.org/FCV.